Our final module in Microbiome 303 covers epidemiology and public health, something that has been at the forefront of everyone's mind due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. This module will be quite a bit shorter than Module 12, just so you know. Here are the learning outcomes. And when we're really talking about epidemiology and public health, while they also track and record disease, the main goal is preventing disease, and that's what we're really going to focus on. If you look at the incidence of infectious disease since 1900 until the current day, it has had a steady decrease since the turn of the century. Deaths per 100,000 have dropped from about 800 in 1900 to less than 70 today. This 90% drop is attributable to a number of societal advances. People today have better nutrition, better living conditions, and more sanitary food and water than at any time in the past. The action of public health departments, who continuously campaign to improve the health of a population, monitor the spread of infectious disease, and advise governments to take action in times of pandemic, are strong positive influences on the incidence of disease. Finally, when most people think of prevention and treatment of disease, they think of antibiotics and vaccines, and we will cover both of these in this lecture. Now, I'm not going to say much more about nutrition and better living conditions, but I do want to say they limit the spread of disease because they increase the strength of the immune system of the population. If people have a stronger immunity, there's less of them that get sick, and there's less incidence of the spread of disease. Prevention of infectious disease involves disrupting the cycle of infection, and there's a number of ways that this can happen. You have a role in this. You take care of yourself, you use good hand washing, you use proper treatment of food, you listen to health officials, and you can decontaminate fomites, which are surfaces that may have been contaminated with illness, in your immediate area. All of these things, the practice of reasonable disinfection, especially hand washing and how you prepare food, can really decrease the spread of illness in your area. Public health departments worldwide also play a role. They will detect and control carriers of a disease. They will do routine testing of individuals, and they will work on various ways to improve the health of individuals. The USDA is involved also in meat and egg processing, ensuring the culling of infected animals before they enter the food supply, and inspection of meat. Local governments do a good job in providing safe water in the form of purification and treatment of the water supply before it gets to you, and the proper treatment of wastewater before it leaves and is released into the environment. There are many other practices that improve the health of society overall. For example, ale filtration can remove molds, and pasteurization of milk and other liquids helps reduce the number of pathogens in them to safe levels. There are a number of other tools available to achieve public health, and in this lecture we will dive into the details. So let's begin. The first one we're going to talk about is sanitation. The connection between poor sanitation and the spread of disease became clear through the studies of John Snow in London. And no, not that Jon Snow. This is not the Game of Thrones. An outbreak of cholera in the city of London in the Golden Square district was devastating the populace. What Snow did was carefully plot the residence of each patient, and this is shown in the figure. Snow discovered that there was a significant cluster of cholera patients around the Broad Street water pump. Legend has it that the removal of the pump handle stopped the epidemic. Snow correctly concluded that germs in the water were causing cholera, and the polluted water was the means of transmitting the disease from person to person. Once they removed the pump handle and people had to go someplace else to get their water, the disease stopped. What this demonstrates is water sanitation is a way that diseases can spread, and good sanitation is a way to stop it. So let's talk a little bit about the sanitation process. All water in modern society is now treated before consumption. If the water comes from underground, the sedimentation and filtration steps can sometimes be skipped. If it comes from an above ground natural source, it is first sedimented to get rid of any large sedimentation in it, then pumped into another bin that has charcoal and a large sand basin to run the water through and filter it. Once it's gone through this filtration process, it will be pumped, it is purified, and it will be pumped into a clear well, which is typically underground. Water is then chlorinated to kill any remaining infectious agents, and then it is pumped into a water tower and distributed through pipes to the community. Our next topic is epidemiology. The work of Snow was part of the beginnings and the foundation of epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of the occurrence, distribution, and determinants of health and disease. Epidemiologists track the natural history of pathogens and their interactions with their hosts. Epidemiologists do their work to foster public health. Public health is the art and science of preventing disease and disability, prolonging life, promoting health of populations, and ensuring a healthful environment through organized community efforts. These efforts began during the Black Death of the 1340s and 50s, and were greatly expanded and codified in the government during the sanitation campaigns that helped stop the spread of tuberculosis in the 19th and early 20th century. Epidemiologists track the natural history of pathogens and their interactions with their hosts. When tracking a disease outbreak, the steps of epidemiology are similar. The epidemiologist first defines a typical case so that the disease can be identified and tracked. Shown here is the case division for COVID-19. While personally I think this is okay, I still think it needs to be expanded. So a patient shouldn't have to have severe symptoms before they can be tested for the disease. We need to find out everybody who has it. In any case, once you have a case definition, field work then begins to determine the extent of the outbreak and its shape. Field work involves a network of hospitals, clinics, health departments, and the CDC. There is a large list of notifiable diseases that must be reported to the CDC. The accumulation of this data leads to the generation of maps and testable hypotheses about the origin of the outbreak. From this data, policy decisions are made to mitigate the outbreak. These can include measures to stop the outbreak at its source if possible, quarantine or social distancing, and pursuit of treatments and vaccines if the outbreak is serious enough. A cool example of tracking is flu trends. It combines the CDC data with Flu Near You. The CDC, again, collects information from all the different public health entities in the country, hospitals, doctors, state public health departments, and accumulates all that information. Flu Near You is a crowdsourced participatory disease surveillance system. People can download the app and they report if they are experiencing flu-like symptoms. It gathers information from users about their health in real time. One thing that's interesting this year is you'll notice that the CDC is reporting large increases in flu-like illnesses. But my suspicion is this is not the actual flu, it's actually COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. The shape of an epidemic curve can tell you a lot about a disease outbreak. If the outbreak involves exposure to a pathogen from food or water source, called a common source epidemic, you will see a large increase in cases followed by a rapid drop. Often these illnesses require exposure to the original source, and once the source is gone, the outbreak subsides. If, however, the epidemic is transmitted host to host, a slower, more progressive rise is observed. For example, the COVID-19 outbreak. Since the human population is immunologically naive to COVID-19, we saw exponential growth of the disease until social distancing measures were put in place. An example of a point source outbreak was an increase in enterohemorrhagic E. coli in 2018. Surveys and detective work by the CDC traced the outbreak to romaine lettuce in Santa Barbara County, California. The problem was traced back to a water reservoir at a farm in that county. This water reservoir tested positive for the bacterial strain. By eliminating that water source and cleaning it up, the outbreak was ended. Quarantine and social distancing are an age-old practice. Shown at the right is an individual quarantined at Staten Island in the 19th century. In many cases, this was on suspicion of yellow fever, and it was thought that this was a useful practice to prevent these individuals from spreading disease. After a quarantine period was over, they were released. Quarantine is still used today, and in fact, it was an effective weapon in stopping the outbreak of COVID-19 in China. But let's talk some more about this. Does quarantining really work? There is some debate on how much you can use it and how effective it is, especially once the disease gets going in a population. The idea is that if you keep 6 people away from others, there's less chance for a pathogen to find new hosts. This isn't theoretical anymore. Imagine you are the president in January of this year. How do you stop the disease from spreading in the US? At what levels do you stop travel? Stopping all travel is nearly impossible. Do you keep it to symptomatic patients and not allow them to travel? Many governments tried to restrict travel from China for symptomatic patients. This doesn't work because asymptomatic carriers are common in COVID-19. In fact, it's now thought they might be the major vehicle of spread, and they transmit the virus to others. So now the illness is here. We are currently practicing social distancing, but does this really work? Because there is no federal order for the behavior of different states, we have a decent way to compare the effects of social distancing. Louisiana has a big Mardi Gras party every year. This year it was February 25th. Remember, at the time there were only 50 known cases of COVID-19 in the country. The virus was spreading in the US undetected, and there were probably individuals in the crowded streets of New Orleans that were spreading the virus. But wait, you say, if COVID-19 has an average incubation period of 5 days, shouldn't we already see cases March 1st? You would be right, if we were testing everyone. We were not. It was only in the middle of March, when tests became somewhat available, and they are still in short supply in many areas, that we started testing. Louisiana has 22,532 cases, or an incidence rate of 517 per 100,000. A stay-at-home order was issued on March 23rd, and about 2 weeks later, the incidence of the illness started to drop. Another example is South Dakota, where at this time there is still no stay-at-home order. The cases started later because it got there later, but they are exponentially exploding now, and they're at 145 per 100,000. Without intervention, I am concerned that in another 5 days, there will be twice as many cases, and I hope they do something soon. In Wisconsin, a stay-at-home order was issued much earlier, when there were only 47 known cases. Remember, in Louisiana, there were over 800 when they issued a stay-at-home order. Since then, there have been 3,875 cases, which is about 66.2 per 100,000, almost 90% less than Louisiana. The number of reported cases peaked on April 7th, and we have been heading down ever since. Unfortunately, the Wisconsin primary was held on April 7th, and this included in-person voting. This was a ridiculously stupid idea. As expected, we are now seeing an uptick in cases despite efforts to mitigate transmission. I will caution that the numbers of cases do fluctuate, and more data is needed to confirm that more infections occurred because of the primary, but it appears to be the case. We will probably have to practice social distancing longer because of this. By looking at the comparison of these three states, it's pretty clear that social distancing can dramatically slow the spread of an illness.